Amazon pioneered behavioral interviewing at scale, so they know a thing or two about them. And of course, how people tend to cheat in particular. And to understand just how serious they are about interviews, they have an entire scoring mechanism, which some call a behaviorally anchored rating scale based on their leadership principles. In each interview, and I'm talking about the on-site here, they ask candidates questions from their leadership principles so they can evaluate your answers based on various criteria. For example, are you someone willing to take ownership in difficult situations, even if it's outside of your area of responsibility here? Why am I flooding you with all this information? Doing it because explaining how these interviews work is essential to understand the level of expectations that Amazon has from people applying for high-paying jobs. Okay, so simply put, they do expect you to take their interviews, behavioral interviews to be specific here, far more seriously when compared to other companies. In order to evaluate answers, you'll notice the interviewer will take a ton of notes of what you say during the interview, basically the stories that you're telling them. These notes will be shared across the hiring team. And after you're done with all these interviews, there will be a meeting to decide your fate. These notes are useful for them to, of course, rate your performance, but there's another lesser-known reason on why they take notes. Some people have a tendency to repeat their best stories. So, for example, if you prepared 7 stories in total, 3 great ones and 4 so-so, you might feel tempted to overuse your 3 great stories. You want them to hear what's best about you, right? You may think this approach is something everyone does, but in reality, they're actually carefully tracking this, and you are going to get disqualified if they catch you reusing your stories. Now, if you're wondering, but then why would they use such a radical approach here? Let me give you 2 scenarios, okay? First, less prepared candidates have no choice but to reuse their stories, okay, since they don't have enough of them in the first place. And the second scenario is when people don't have enough stories, is when they're inexperienced for the role they're applying for, or some even prefer to overuse and reward their stories in a bid to sound more senior. As you can see here, even if it may seem that reusing stories is a minor issue, it's something associated with either unprepared or inexperienced candidates, neither of which will go well with a company which takes interviews so seriously, if you remember my notes in the beginning of the video. Now, as a closing remark here, what are some ways to prevent this deadly mistake of reusing stories, besides, of course, the obvious one? And I'm going to give you 3 options here. First option, you can prepare enough stories by basically predicting the minimum number of stories that you'll need during your interview. You should know they usually screen you on 2 principles per interview, talking about the on-site here. And if you multiply that by the number of interview rounds in your loop, you'll get a better idea on the number of stories you'll actually need. Usually the more senior the role, the more rounds you'll have, and therefore the expectation you prepare more stories. Second workaround here for not making it obvious you're using the same story, and this is especially when you have an important highlight in your career which perfectly fits into multiple behaviors. When answering a question in the STAR format, you could present the situation differently so they don't sound as the same story. So, for example, first you could say this happened in 2019 while working as a PM, and the second time you talk about it, you could rephrase the situation to something on the lines of, I was recently working on Project Sigma in charge of a team of 6. So notice how the keywords make it sound completely different, right? And the third option, which I actually recommend here, is to simply ask your interviewer for another question. Hey, I have a great story to answer your question, which I just used with your colleague. Would you like me to go ahead with the same story? Or maybe you can ask me another question. And don't worry, they do have multiple questions to choose from. They need more questions because not everyone gives a conclusive answer on the behavior they're screening you on from the first shot. I hope you found this information useful, and thank you very much for watching.